Well, how about anything written by Hans Christian Andersen? There is no Hans Christian Andersen recommended. No Little Match Girl. No Emperor Has No Clothes. Why? Because we don't want to be able to stand up and say the Common Core has no clothes. Nothing. No Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. None of the great stories are actually put into the 2nd and 3rd grade years. So what happens? Students lose interest. They're not going to be enthralled by these things. So that's what's going on. And then you have a way that is supposedly their means of selecting texts. Okay? And this is when you get into Appendix A of the Common Core English Standards. And so they choose text and they say over and over again, well, you've got to read complex texts. And the older you go, the older you are, you have to read the more complex texts. As though we needed that piece of advice. How then do you decide what constitutes a complex text? That's where in is ushered the lexile framework, which determines how complex a text actually is. We couldn't sit back with people who have common sense and say, you know, I think kids in the 1st grade should read fables, because that's not scientifically and mathematically sound. So we bring in this computer model called the lexile framework. And in we pop the text, it does some machinations, and then out pops a complexity rating, and then we know where to put the text. This lexile framework is so inadequate that it places The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, 581 pages. What grade do you think it puts it in? The 2nd to 3rd grade range. I kid you not. The 2nd to 3rd grade range. Because according to the lexile framework, this is how complex the text is. Now I'm going to just open up The Grapes of Wrath to a random page so we can use a little common sense here to see if it actually works. Noah moved slowly, spoke seldom, and then so slowly that people who did not know him often thought him stupid. He was not stupid, but he was strange. He had little pride, no sexual urges. He worked and slept in a curious rhythm that nevertheless sufficed him. He was fond of his folks, but never showed it in any way. Although an observer could not have told why, Noah left the impression of being misshapen. Pa thought he knew why Noah was strange, but Pa was ashamed and never told. For on the night when Noah was born, Pa, frightened at the spreading thighs, alone in the house and horrified at the screaming wretch his wife had become. Okay, I'm going to stop reading there. Is that what you want your 3rd grader reading? No. Of course not. This is an error. Now, it's not that they say that The Grapes of Wrath ought to be one of the 2nd to 3rd grade readings. Remember, they're reading these monosyllabic, recently published things. But the lexile framework on which they base everything says that that's a 2nd to 3rd grade text. Why? Well, if The Grapes of Wrath is not very complex, and by the way, Bible stories would be probably at a 1st grade range because they're simply written. What's going to rate really high? Literature, or not literature, but things that are written that have a lot of jargon in them, such as the informational text that they want to constitute complex text so that students in the high school can read them. For example, an article written in the New Yorker in the summer of 2009 called Atul Gawanda, that's the author, called The Cost Conundrum, Healthcare Costs in McAllen, Texas. That would be read by seniors. Now, does anybody remember why we were talking about healthcare costs in the summer of 2009? Obamacare? So if you want students to like modern legislation, you call it a complex text, and you have the lexile framework backing you up, and then you put it into what used to be called a literature class, and you call that training for a 21st century global economy. I think something's afoot here. So, we go on. That was Appendix A. In Appendix B, we have a list of exemplar texts. Now, a lot of people have been confused by Appendix B, because if you look at Appendix B, you'll find some good things as well as some not so good things. But let me tell you how to read that document. There are 2 or 3 tricks. Number 1, Appendix B, I think, is largely window dressing, because they want people to go to it and see that there's Shakespeare there, and people will say, okay, well, it does have Shakespeare, so we shouldn't be too worried. Nonetheless, what Appendix B does is list a whole lot of books and then gives you little snippets of these books. And that's exactly how they're going to be read in class. Because under the dictates and demands of modern testing, students will not be reading complete works of literature. They'll be reading little snippets of literature and making supposedly quick decisions about how literary works supposedly work. But you don't have to read the whole book. You just have to know the little literary jargon to go with it, and that'll prepare you for the test. So that's the first thing. Appendix B is actually a model of the literature that the students will almost read. The second thing is, when you start thinking about what doesn't get put in Appendix B, and what does get put in Appendix B is model or exemplar text, things get a little fishy. I can find no literature in Appendix B that is inspired by the Christian religion. None. Supposedly, they like autobiographies. Well, Augustine's Confessions, the first great autobiography, is not to be found. John Milton's Paradise Lost, not even a selection of it, is to be mentioned. That is the greatest English epic. Of course, there's no Bible. Why would they put in the opening chapter of Genesis? Maybe the only most famous and foundational work in our literary heritage. That goes without saying. That's not going to be there. No American literature inspired by religion. No poetry of Anne Bradstreet, the famous Puritan poet. No Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Do y'all remember reading that in high school? I remember that. A great sermon. Not there. Nothing inspired by religion. Similarly, there's no Benjamin Franklin in Appendix B. Now, Benjamin Franklin, you might say he's not a literary author, but he has written one of the great autobiographies that used to be read by all students. I know my grandfather read it. Practically everyone in America used to read the autobiography. And think about it. Here's a man who was a great patriot, a great thinker, who was a scientist, and somebody who founded institutions. Wouldn't this be a model of clear thinking to read through his life and his self-education? Not there. I think the reason is because Benjamin Franklin is the anti-bureaucrat. Benjamin Franklin is the man of self-discipline and self-help. If you read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, you would never want the Common Core. You'd want to go out and start your own school. So it's no accident that he's not there. There are other things that are not in the Common Core. In the there is no Charles Dickens in the Common Core. How? None. There's Scrooges, the people at the Common Core. They don't even have Dickens. There is no Mark Twain recommended at the high school. So what is in the Common Core? Well, a lot of postmodern authors, a lot of authors that are put there, I think, pretty clearly because they're multicultural, many of them currently living, and they fit the progressive idea of what modern literature departments want students to read. And quite frankly, if you look closely enough at Appendix B, it looks a lot more like the Oprah Book Club than it does anything like a true Common Core. Why is that important? Well, it gives students an extremely depressing view of life. And I want to show that to you in just a minute. So Appendix B, if it's looked at carefully as a list of exemplar texts, I think is a scary thing. I'll say one more thing about Appendix B. I've had state legislators pick it up and say, look, the First Amendment is read in here. That's the Constitution. Are you in favor of the Constitution? Well, sure, who's not? But look at how they're actually teaching the Constitution. At the middle school level, they recommend the preamble to the Constitution, and they recommend the First Amendment. Not the Second Amendment. Not the 10th Amendment. Somehow, 8th graders aren't capable of understanding the Second Amendment. Interesting. And then at the high school level, they recommend reading the whole Bill of Rights. The whole thing. Wow. But not any of the Constitution. Meanwhile, on page 95 of Appendix B, and then on page roughly 176 of Appendix B, almost at the end, they have modern authors writing about the Constitution, presumably to help people understand the small selections of the Constitution that the students have read. No. No, they do not recommend the Hillsdale online course on the Constitution. None of that. Good guess. They recommend, at the middle school level, a book by someone named Linda Monk, who quotes, who starts out by saying, we the people, which we the people? So-and-so wasn't included, and so-and-so wasn't included. And then they have Justice Thurgood Marshall saying, The Founding Fathers meant by we the people, they never meant the whole people. They didn't think that, that a woman or the descendant of a black slave would ever be a part of the Supreme Court that ends up construing the Constitution. And therefore the Constitution must have an evolving nature. Evolving nature. All this is said in a space of about this. So what do we learn from the first black Supreme Court justice? That the founders were racists and bigots and chauvinists, and that's why the Constitution has to be evolving. Now, the number of inaccuracies that are in that are just tremendous. First of all, if he's talking about the franchise, that's not true. The franchise, as we know from Article 1, Section 2, is in the House of Representatives, is left to the states. And we also know that at the time that the Constitution was adopted, there were women and there were free blacks voting in some states. And the Constitution didn't undermine any of that. In fact, the Constitution, in a way, is an invitation to expand the franchise. At the high school level, there's another constitutional scholar brought in who has a book out called The Constitution, a Biography. And he's a well-known fellow, I should say. He's a professor at Yale. And he is writing specifically on the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Apportionment Clause. And his book is so chopped up that the selection doesn't even make any sense. But you can tell he's talking about the Three-Fifths Compromise, which the students are not required to read. But in his account, the words that are used are vicious, masterclass, camouflaged, and ugly. So what's the point of that? If the point were to understand the Three-Fifths Compromise, that would take 3 or 4 pages of serious legal reasoning, which this fellow is probably capable of. But the purpose of having this chopped up selection is so that the teachers know to tell the students, see, the founders really were a master class, and they were just trying to establish their own power. That's the impression that you get of the Constitution if you follow the Common Core. Let me give you a couple of examples of things that I have found in Common Core textbooks. Some of these Common Core textbooks will make their way, I guarantee you, into the state of Georgia. Supposedly, in a Common Core textbook written by Prentice Hall, you have Frankenstein, or at least you have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. 17 pages devoted to it, ostensibly, in this Common Core textbook. Except if you go to the 17 pages, you don't find anything that is remotely close to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The first 3 or 4 pages have a modern author who talks about all the scary stories that she read while she was growing up. And some of them are just absolutely silly. There's also a picture of Frankenstein, the monster, taken from a movie circa 1950 that looks ridiculous. And the teachers are invited to have a discussion about why the monster looks so scary. The students are invited to write an autobiography of a monster. Okay, think that one through. They're to write an autobiography of a monster. So they have to turn themselves, in their imagination, into a monster and then tell a story from the monster's perspective. Why? Well, because monster stories are always told from the human perspective, and that's not fair to the monsters. And so we need to be able to empathize with the monsters, and so this is the way to do it. I'm not making this up. Now, if you were to read Frankenstein, the actual book, you would find that much of the story is told from the monster's perspective, but that's not even alluded to in this selection. They're also invited to dress up as monsters and to act out a pseudo-Frankenstein play, except nothing from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In fact, no word from Shelley's Frankenstein is actually included in the selection. Instead, you have 5 pages devoted to live from New York. It's Saturday night. That's right, 5.5 pages of a skit done on Saturday Night Live appear in this textbook. Now, in my day, we didn't have to be told by our English teachers to watch Saturday Night Live. But in fact, they are in this. In fact, there's supposed to be discussion about all the great characters that are on Saturday Night Live prior to doing the Saturday Night Live skit. Let me read a selection from the dialogue. Frankenstein's monster shows up in a village. The whole village goes crazy. They start accusing each other of things. Villager number 1 points to the head villager and says, "Well, maybe you're the monster." The head villager shakes his head. "I'm not the monster." He points to Frankenstein's monster. "Look at him. He's got a square head and green skin. Frankenstein's monster responds, "Oh, great. Now it's a racial thing. You know what? You guys are a bunch of fascists." In the margin of the teacher's edition, the teacher is prompted to say this: "Point out the use of the term fascist. Explain its traditional political meaning and how it has been extended to refer to any right-wing extremist group." Do y'all listen to Joel's radio program? I wonder if he's ever had anybody from extreme fascist right-wing groups on there. I wonder if the senator would ever talk to me. Well, that's what they're being given, a vocabulary that is a progressive vocabulary, I think, to not like so-called extreme right-wing groups. So, here's another one. We talk about the sort of depressing postmodern things that you would find in a textbook. How about this one? This is called The Story of an Hour, written by Kate Chopin, who was an early, really radical feminist writer and is thought well of nowadays by the Academy. And in this book, oh, by the way, let me back up. Can you guess what grade level the Saturday Night Live skit was supposed to take place at? What's that? 4th grade? No, the 12th grade. The second semester of the 12th grade.